The winter of 1812 hung over Eversley like a shroud of grey lace. Inside the marble-lined study of the Ashford estate, a fire burned low, its embers reflecting off rows of law books and duty-bound portraits. Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Eversley, stood before the hearth with posture so rigid it seemed he were carved from the same stone that built his house. He had decided what he must do, not for himself, but for England, for honour, for the legacy his father's name demanded. Love, to him, was an ornament for poets and fools. A duke needed a wife who could govern a house, not his heart. The letter of proposal was written that morning, ink precise, sentiment absent. To Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, it began, our families have long been allied in duty. Let that bond be sealed in union. The messenger departed before Sebastian could question his own coldness. He did not believe in hesitation. Hesitation was the breach through which feeling entered, and feeling had no place in duty. That evening, London society buzzed. The papers announced it in bold ink. The Duke of Eversley has chosen Lady Eleanor. A union of wealth and rank, a triumph of practicality. At the Whitcomb estate, Eleanor read the letter in silence. Her mother wept with relief, her father smiled with ambition. But Eleanor felt only the cool weight of a decision made without her voice. Still she was a woman of sense, raised to obey the world, as it was written for her. Days later, when the Duke came to formalize his proposal, the scene was executed like a ritual. No flowers, no poetry, no hesitation. He bowed with measured grace, and she curtsied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Their exchange lasted 7 minutes, an agreement between titles, not hearts. When he slipped the ring upon her finger, Eleanor glanced once at his face and saw nothing of affection there, only a quiet resolve as cold as marble. Yet as their hands touched, a small current moved between them, barely a breath of something alive. She withdrew too quickly to name it, and he dismissed it as imagination, but the air remembered. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, reluctant flakes. In the distance, bells chimed for a wedding not yet celebrated. Within the Duke's mind, a thought echoed uninvited. What if duty was only a mask to hide the fear of feeling? He banished it at once, yet that banished thought would return to haunt him in the form of a dance that would undo everything he believed about himself. Spring came dressed in golden glass that year, carrying with it the promise of a season too bright for hearts as weary as theirs. The Eversley engagement ball was the grandest event London had seen in months, a spectacle meant to silence gossip and please Parliament alike. The Duke's duty was clear: appear composed, dance once, smile seldom, and give the ton a performance worthy of his title. The ballroom glimmered like a jewel box. Chandeliers spilled light upon silks and jewels, the air thick with perfume and whispered envy. Gentlemen murmured of land and lineage, while ladies measured glances and reputations. At the centre of it all stood Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, radiant in a gown of crimson satin that glowed like fire beneath the chandeliers. Every head turned as she descended the marble staircase, not because she was the most beautiful woman there, but because she carried herself with something rarer: quiet dignity. The Duke waited below, his expression unreadable, his every movement a study in restraint. When she reached him, he bowed slightly, offering his hand. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, soft, melancholic, unfamiliar. "A new composition," whispered someone in the crowd from an unknown musician. The tune wound through the air like a spell, and as Sebastian led her to the floor, the murmurs faded into silence. They moved together, elegant, precise, mechanical. She followed his lead without falter, her eyes downcast, her heartbeat a drum of nerves. But somewhere between the second and third turn, something changed. The music deepened, the strings trembled with longing, the piano rose like a confession. The Duke's hand, steady upon her waist, seemed to tremble for just a moment. His gaze, once distant, met hers, and in that instant the room disappeared. All that remained was the rhythm, the rise and fall of breath, the soft brush of silk against his sleeve, the way her eyes held a spark of defiance against sorrow. He had not known she could smile like that, a fleeting curve of lips that held warmth enough to thaw stone. The melody seemed to mirror her heartbeat, pulling him closer with each measure. His jaw tightened, not from discomfort, but fear. The kind of fear a man feels when the walls he built begin to crack. Around them, the guests watched in fascination. "The Duke smiles," someone whispered in disbelief. "He smiles." When the music ended, Eleanor curtsied, her cheeks flushed, her breath unsteady. He bowed stiffly, though his pulse raced with a confusion he could not name. For the first time in his life, Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Eversley, could not summon words. As she turned away, her perfume lingered, soft, floral, devastating. He watched her walk toward the far end of the ballroom, where light met shadow, and in that shimmering distance, something within him shifted. It was small, fragile, but undeniable, the first thread of emotion tugged loose from years of iron control. He left the ballroom without a word. Outside, the night was cool and still, the stars indifferent witnesses to his unrest. He pressed a gloved hand to his chest, as though to still the wildness there. "It was only a dance," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying, for one dance had made him forget his title, his purpose, his vows, and that terrified him more than war, scandal, or death ever could. The morning after the ball dawned pale and restless, as though the world itself was reluctant to rise. The air smelled of rain and roses, the lingering breath of celebration faded into silence. Eversley Hall, vast and echoing, seemed colder than before, its marble corridors reverberating with the ghost of a waltz. The Duke had not slept. He had tried. He'd poured himself brandy, reviewed estate accounts, even walked the length of his library a dozen times. Yet everywhere he turned, he heard it. That melody, her melody, the soft rise and fall of the strings, the warmth of her hand in his, the quiet courage in her eyes. He had not thought of a woman's gaze in years, not since the night his mother had died, whispering that love was a luxury only the poor could afford. He told himself it had been a moment, a trick of light and music. But something inside him, a part long buried, refused to listen. For the first time in years, Sebastian Ashford felt alive. It unsettled him beyond reason. In the drawing room, sunlight streamed through tall windows. The servants moved quietly, glancing toward their master, who sat motionless before a half-read letter. His fiancée's letter. The Duke read it again and again, tracing her delicate handwriting. "My lord, last night's waltz was most unexpected. You danced beautifully. I did not know you could smile." That line, simple, sincere, cut deeper than any accusation. Smile. The word mocked him. Since when had he forgotten how? He set the letter aside and rose abruptly, crossing to the window. Below, the gardens stretched green and wild, filled with early spring blooms. He caught sight of movement, a flash of crimson among the hedges. Lady Eleanor. She was walking alone, her skirts brushing dew-damp grass, her gloved hand trailing along the rose arbor. She paused to free a trapped petal from a thorn. That small act, that tenderness, drew his gaze and held it. Unseen, he watched her from above. Something in her stillness disarmed him. the grace with which she existed even when unobserved. He thought of her laughter during their dance, soft and unguarded, and felt the ache of wanting to hear it again. When he turned away, his reflection in the glass startled him. The mask he'd worn all his life, calm, distant, unshakable, had cracked. Beneath it, a man looked back, a man uncertain. Later that day, duty summoned him to the council chamber. Yet, even among the echo of debate and the droning of peers, his thoughts betrayed him. When Lord Pembroke discussed trade, he heard the waltz. When Lady Chelsea mentioned the wedding preparations, he thought of her letter. By evening his temper had frayed thin as thread. As he returned home, the scent of rain greeted him again. The same storm that had brewed inside him now lingered in the air, heavy and electric. He dismissed his valet and strode into the ballroom, the same room where his world had begun to tilt. The floor still carried faint scuffs from their dance. He stood there, motionless, staring at the spot where her gown had swept past his boots. "This is absurd," he muttered aloud. "A duke does not lose sleep over sentiment." But sentiment had already claimed him. That night, Eleanor sat by her window miles away, gazing at the same rain, thinking of him. She told herself he was proud, unreachable, a man of marble. Yet she couldn't forget how his hand had trembled, how for one heartbeat she'd felt his pulse quicken against her palm. Two souls, bound by duty, separated by silence, lay awake, haunted by the same impossible question. Was love the very thing they had both been taught to fear? The days that followed the ball unfolded like a quiet battle neither dared to name. Lady Eleanor had moved into Eversley Hall for the formal preparations of her engagement, a custom of convenience, though tongues wagged nonetheless. Society called it propriety, the servants called it destiny. Yet to Eleanor the manor felt more like a gilded cage, vast, echoing, and filled with the uneasy stillness of things unsaid. She kept to the garden in the mornings and the library in the afternoons, preferring the company of old books to polite conversation. Her laughter, soft and infrequent, seemed to travel through the cold corridors like sunlight through mist. And though she told herself she did not care for the Duke's attention, she was painfully aware of his presence even when unseen. Sebastian, on the other hand, was a man besieged by contradiction. His life had always been ruled by duty, by order, by rules written in stone. But now he found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hall. He noticed her in ways unbecoming of a man of logic, the way she lingered before a painting of the sea, her lips moving as though whispering to the waves, the way her fingers traced the edges of a piano key when she passed it, as if afraid to wake the melody. He would pass her in the corridor and nod curtly, pretending indifference. Yet, after she had gone, his gaze would linger upon the space she had occupied, his breath shallow. Once he caught her in the rose garden at dusk, the wind teasing strands of hair from her bun. She was humming, faint, unguarded. The tune was the same from their dance. He froze, every muscle tight with memory. "Forgive me," she said when she noticed him. "I didn't mean to disturb." "Disturb," he repeated, his voice low. The house could use such disturbances. She blinked, surprised by the rare warmth in his tone. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he turned away sharply, retreating behind his practiced distance. "It grows cold," he said, his voice once more composed. "You should go inside." But long after she had gone, he remained in the garden, his gloved fingers brushing the place her footsteps had marked in the grass. Inside, his steward found him later, standing before the window, lost in thought. "Shall I bring more light, your grace?" the man asked. "No," the Duke said quietly. "Let the dark be." In her room, Eleanor wrote in her journal by candlelight, "He confuses me. Cold one moment, kind the next. Perhaps that is what power does, teaches a man to fear the warmth he once needed most." And somewhere deep in the house, Sebastian sat alone at his desk, her laughter echoing faintly in his mind. He took up his pen intending to write a letter of business, but instead his hand betrayed him. On the parchment, almost against his will, he wrote her name. He stared at it, at those 8 simple letters that seemed to carry more weight than all the estates of Eversley. And then, before reason could stop him, he tore the page and threw it into the fire. The flames consumed it eagerly, curling it into ash. But the name, her name, stayed burning in his chest, and from that night forward the Duke began to lose the war he had waged all his life, the war against his own heart. The weeks that followed carried a strange tension, a quiet storm building beneath the polished calm of Eversley Hall. London's social circles, ever hungry for scandal, had begun to whisper. The Duke, they said, had grown restless. He was often seen walking the gardens alone, missing council meetings and glancing far too often at his fiancée. Some called it affection. Others called it weakness. But one rumour in particular crept like poison through the season's gossip. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb had captured more than one man's heart. It began at the charity concert in Bath. Eleanor, encouraged by her friend Lady Violet, had agreed to play piano for the evening's guests. Her performance was graceful, unassuming, a melody soft as candlelight. Yet among the crowd sat Lord Gregory Harland, a poet notorious for romantic indiscretions. After her performance, he approached her with exaggerated courtesy and murmured, "Your hands were made for far more than keys." The remark, overheard by a dozen eager ears, bloomed into rumour before the night was done. By the time the gossip reached Sebastian's ears, it had grown teeth. "The Duke's bride-to-be entertains a poet's admiration," they said, smirking behind their fans. That evening, when Eleanor returned to Eversley, she found the Duke waiting in the library. The firelight threw his face into sharp relief. Too calm, too composed, the kind of stillness that hides an ocean underneath. "Did you enjoy the concert?" he asked without looking up. "I did," she said cautiously. "It was for the Wounded Veterans Fund. The donations were—" "And Lord Harland," he interrupted, his voice like silk stretched over glass. "Was he part of the charity as well?" She froze, the faintest flush rising to her cheeks. "He thanked me for my performance. That was all." "Was it?" His gaze lifted then, eyes cold but wounded. "You must forgive my curiosity, Lady Eleanor. It seems the world is speaking of you with unrestrained admiration." Eleanor's breath caught. She had endured many forms of cruelty in her life, condescension, disregard, mockery. But this quiet accusation from the one man who had never pretended to care, cut deeper than she expected. "Is that what you think of me?" she asked softly. "I think," he said after a pause, "that you are not as untouched by the world as I imagined." Her hand trembled, but her voice did not. "And you, my lord, are not as untouched by jealousy as you pretend." That struck him. His jaw tightened. "Jealousy implies affection." She took a step closer, her eyes shining not with tears, but fury. "No, your grace, it implies possession, and you have no right to claim what you do not love." The silence that followed was unbearable. The fire hissed, as if recoiling from the heat between them. When she finally turned away, her voice was quiet but resolute. "You may have my hand, my name, and my obedience, but you will never have my heart while you treat it as a contract." Then she left, the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving him standing amid the ashes of pride and longing. That night, Sebastian walked the halls until dawn, his thoughts a storm. Every word she had spoken replayed in his mind, each one true, each one deserved. He realized with horror that her anger did not wound him because it insulted his pride. It wounded him because it meant he'd lost her trust. By morning, she was gone. A letter left on his desk bore her seal. Delicate, final. "Do not follow me. You will not find the woman you imagined, only the one you failed to see." Sebastian read it again and again until the ink blurred under his tears. Tears he'd sworn a man like him would never shed. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Eversley understood what it meant to be a fool. Not for duty, not for reputation, but for love. The days that followed her departure stretched into a kind of purgatory. Eversley Hall, once full of noise and expectation, became a mausoleum of silence. Servants walked softly, afraid to stir their master's temper, or worse, his grief. The fire in the Duke's study burned low, and the letters upon his desk piled high and unanswered. The great estate that had once defined his power now mocked him, echoing with the absence of her laughter. For Sebastian Ashford, time had always been measured by order, documents, schedules, obligations. But now each passing hour was a weight upon his chest. He moved through the halls like a ghost, haunting his own home, his mind circling endlessly back to her final words. "You failed to see me." He saw her everywhere. In the drawing room, sunlight catching the empty space where she once sat reading. In the music chamber, her untouched piano gathering dust. Even in the garden, where a single red rose had withered in the frost, the one she'd planted weeks before. On the third night, he found himself in the ballroom again, though no guests had danced there since she left. The chandeliers were dark, the air thick with memory. He stood at the center of the floor where they'd once waltzed, hearing the phantom melody in his mind, the same one that had begun it all. His hand flexed, as if still feeling hers within it. He whispered into the emptiness, "I never meant to hurt you, Eleanor." The words broke something open, his voice cracked, not with pride, but pain. "You said I could not love, and perhaps you were right, but God help me. I cannot forget you." He sank to his knees, the echo of the word fool ringing in his ears. That night, unable to sleep, he went to the library and opened the old piano she'd so often looked at but never played. The keys were cold beneath his fingers, but he struck them anyway, awkwardly, haltingly. The sound was jarring, discordant. Yet he persisted, until at last one soft chord filled the room with aching warmth, the melody that had haunted him since the ball returned, faint but clear. The Fool's Waltz. He froze, realization dawning like dawn through fog. The music, the moment, the feeling. It had never been about the dance. It had been about her. She was the music that had awakened something human within him. Without her, he was once again just the man of marble he had always feared becoming. He pushed back from the piano, his breath shaking. On the mantelpiece stood her forgotten locket, small, golden, unremarkable to anyone else. Inside it he found a lock of his own hair, cut from their engagement portrait, wrapped beside a folded slip of paper. The words, written in her delicate hand, read simply, "I wish I could believe you capable of love." That was the moment the Duke of Eversley broke. He rang for his horse before the dawn had fully risen. "Have the carriage readied for Whitcomb Estate," he commanded, his tone sharper than it had been in months. The butler hesitated. "It is past midnight, Your Grace. The roads—" "Then I'll ride." And so he did. Through rain and mud, through the howling wind, through miles of cold and guilt, he rode toward her. Not as a duke, not as a man of duty, but as a soul desperate to make right what pride had undone. Each hoofbeat was a prayer. Let her forgive me, let her still care. And when the storm reached its peak, thunder splitting the heavens open, he whispered the only truth he had left to give. "I proposed out of duty, but I return out of love." The night was a tempest made flesh. Rain came down like shards of glass, slicing through the dark as thunder rolled across the hills. The Duke's horse stumbled once upon the slick road, but pressed on, driven by his rider's unyielding desperation. Sebastian Ashford, drenched to the bone and half mad with exhaustion, saw the distant glow of Whitcomb Manor flickering through the storm. His heart leapt and faltered in the same beat. By the time he reached the gates, his cloak clung heavy to his shoulders, his hair plastered to his forehead. Lightning illuminated the estate in harsh flashes. Tall windows, silent corridors, the faint outline of the woman he had come to find. He dismounted before the servant could open the door and push through, boots leaving trails of water on the marble floor. Eleanor was there, standing at the top of the grand staircase. The candle in her hand trembled, light catching her face like something divine and distant. For a long, breathless moment they simply looked at each other. Two souls divided by pride, reunited by pain. "My lord," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the storm, "you should not have come." He climbed the steps slowly, every inch of him shaking from cold and emotion. "Perhaps," he said hoarsely, "but I could not stay away." Her eyes flickered, uncertain. "Why?" He stopped before her, the distance between them small enough for him to feel the heat of the candle she held. Rain dripped from his coat onto the rug. His chest rose and fell like a man facing execution. "Because every mile I rode I realized how blind I've been. You asked me once if I was capable of love. I didn't answer. I couldn't." He reached up, fingers trembling. "But the truth is, I feared love. I feared how it would make me weak, how it would undo the man I was raised to be. And then I met you. And you made me realize weakness was only another word for being alive." The candlelight quivered between them. Eleanor's breath caught, but she said nothing. "I proposed out of duty," he continued, voice breaking. "I thought I was saving my family, my legacy, my name, but all I saved was my own emptiness. The night we danced, something changed. You smiled and I—" He stopped, eyes glistening. "I haven't stopped hearing that waltz since. It plays every time I close my eyes." Tears welled in hers then, mingling with the rain that still fell from his hair. "Sebastian." "I am not asking for forgiveness," he whispered. "I only ask to see that look in your eyes once more. Not pity, not anger, but the warmth you gave me when I didn't deserve it." She set the candle down, the flame bending in the draught. "You hurt me," she said softly. "You made me believe I was only a piece of your duty." "I did," he admitted, "and I have lived every hour since regretting it. If you cannot forgive me, I will still be grateful to have loved you once, even if only in vain." She stared at him for a long moment, this man who had been untouchable, unshakable, now trembling before her like a sinner at confession. Then slowly she stepped forward. Her hand rose, brushing rain from his cheek. "You are a fool, Sebastian Ashford." He almost laughed, the sound raw and uneven. "Yes," he murmured. A fool for love. Then her hand slipped to the back of his neck, pulling him down into her kiss. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees, but within that moment, time stopped. There were no titles, no duties, no expectations, only two broken hearts finding their rhythm again. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his, whispering through tears, "Don't ever make me doubt you again." "Never," he breathed. "Not even death could make me forget this." Outside, the thunder rolled one last time before the sky began to clear, leaving only the gentle sound of rain. The world's applause for a love that had survived pride, pain, and distance. Spring returned to London as if the heavens themselves wished to bear witness to their redemption. Word of the Duke's reconciliation spread quietly, carried not by gossip, but by awe. Eversley Hall, once a monument to duty and isolation, now seemed to hum with an energy no one could quite name. The servants smiled more often. The halls smelled of lilac and waxed wood instead of dust and regret. And at the heart of it all was Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, soon to be Duchess, no longer out of arrangement, but by love freely chosen. The Duke, ever a man of restraint, announced one last ball before their wedding. "A dance," he said to her, "to right what I once ruined." Eleanor only smiled. "Then I shall choose the music," she replied. That night the ballroom was reborn. Chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles. Musicians tuned their violins beneath ceilings painted with angels. It was the same room where everything had begun, the same polished floor, the same towering mirrors, but the air now pulsed with something warmer, alive. When the Duke entered, the crowd fell into reverent silence. He was no longer the cold, unyielding figure they remembered. He had shed his armor, not in attire, but in presence. Gone was the man who ruled from distance. In his place stood one who had learned humility. His gaze searched for her, and when he found her across the room, the world seemed to tilt once more. Eleanor stood in a gown of ivory silk, simple yet luminous. No jewels, no crown, only a single red rose pinned at her shoulder, the color of her courage, the echo of that first dance. When she met his eyes, her heart did not race with nerves, but with recognition. They had been through ruin and rain, and still, somehow, they had found each other. He crossed the room without hesitation, his gloved hand outstretched. "My lady," he said softly, "may I have this dance?" She curtsied with a teasing glimmer in her eyes. "Only if you promise not to frown through it this time." A ripple of laughter spread among the guests, but when the orchestra began to play, the world fell away. The melody was familiar, the Fool's Waltz. But tonight it no longer carried sorrow. It bloomed with warmth, the violins singing of forgiveness, the piano humming with hope. Sebastian led her gently, his hand at her waist, firm yet reverent, his eyes never leaving hers. Their movements were slower than before, more deliberate, every step an unspoken vow. "You've changed," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You simply made me remember who I was before duty turned me to stone." As they turned beneath the crystal light, the guests watched in silence, spellbound. This was not performance. It was truth in motion, the kind of love that does not demand attention but commands it by existing. Halfway through the waltz, Sebastian leaned closer, his voice barely above the music. "Do you remember what I said when I first proposed?" "I remember every word," she murmured. "It was all duty and titles." He nodded, eyes soft. "Then let me offer my true proposal now." He stopped dancing. Before the astonished crowd, he went down on one knee, not out of ceremony, but sincerity. The room gasped. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I proposed to you once as a duke, bound by obligation, but tonight I ask you as a man, heart to heart, not title to title. Will you marry me not because society demands it, but because we both have learned that love is the only duty worth keeping?" Tears welled in her eyes. She knelt beside him, took his trembling hand, and whispered, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." The orchestra swelled, the dancers cheered, and as they rose together the crowd parted around them, allowing them to finish the dance as husband and wife in spirit, if not yet by vow. When the final note faded, the Duke bent his head and kissed her hand. "Then let history call me what it will," he murmured. "A fool for love and proud of it." And for the first time he did not care who heard. Morning came gently to Eversley Hall, the kind of morning that feels like forgiveness, soft, golden, and still. Sunlight crept through lace curtains, tracing the edges of the world the way a lover traces the lines of a familiar face. The house, once ruled by formality and silence, now breathed warmth. The staff moved through the halls with laughter instead of fear. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to watch with softened eyes, as though the ghosts of the Ashford line had finally found peace. In the drawing-room, the Duke sat before the fire, his waistcoat undone, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside him. Across from him, Eleanor read aloud from a small book of poetry, her voice lilting with quiet amusement. It was a poem about foolish men and wiser women, a fact that did not escape him. "Are you enjoying my humiliation, Duchess?" he teased, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Only slightly," she replied, eyes twinkling above the page. "It's rare to find truth written so plainly." He laughed, a sound once foreign to him, now as natural as breathing. It startled even himself sometimes, the ease of it. He leaned back, watching her as she read. Her hair was loose, her gown pale blue, her feet tucked beneath her chair. There was nothing grand about her in that moment, nothing performative, and yet she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. When she looked up, she found him staring. "What?" she asked softly. "I'm trying to remember the exact moment I fell in love with you," he said. "Was it when you smiled during that first dance? Or when you walked away from me and left me to face my own emptiness?" She set the book aside, rising to stand behind his chair. Her hands slid gently onto his shoulders. "Perhaps it wasn't a moment," she murmured. "Perhaps it was a slow undoing. The kind love never demands, but quietly insists upon." He reached up, covering her hands with his. "You undid me completely," he said. She leaned forward, resting her cheek against his hair. "Good," she whispered. "You were much too tightly wound." He chuckled, turning slightly to look at her. "I'll never be that man again, Eleanor. The one who thought love was weakness." Her expression softened. "And I'll never be the woman who mistakes silence for strength." They stayed like that for a while. No music, no audience, no grand declarations. Only the steady rhythm of two people who had found peace not in perfection, but in understanding. Later that afternoon they walked through the gardens, hand in hand. The roses Eleanor had planted were in full bloom, deep red and fragrant. She paused before one and smiled. "Do you know," she said, "when I first came here, I thought these grounds were beautiful, but lifeless. Now look at them." He brushed a petal between his fingers. "You brought them back to life." She turned to him. "No, Sebastian, we did." He studied her face in the sunlight, the faint freckles across her nose, the sincerity in her eyes, and felt that strange ache of gratitude again. He had fought battles for honor, for country, for legacy, but none had required such courage as learning to love. As they stood there, the church bells from the village began to ring, their melody floating through the open air. Eleanor leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and for a moment it felt as though all the noise of the world had quieted just to watch them. Inside the hall, a maid passed by the piano, the same one that had gathered dust for years, and smiled as she noticed it open once more, a sheet of music waiting on the stand. The Fool's Waltz. When the Duke saw it later, he asked her, "Did you place that there?" Eleanor only smiled and said, "Perhaps love did." And when he kissed her forehead beneath the morning sun, the words that left his lips were neither grand nor rehearsed, just simple truth. "You are my heart's redemption, Eleanor. My reason for every foolish thing I'll ever do,